You're sitting outside a camp. It's roughly 30,000 years ago. The sun is going down. You've spent the day hunting, gathering, carrying things, and arguing about where to sleep. You're exhausted. And then 2 people in your group do something. They stand in front of everyone. There's some kind of gesture, an exchange, a declaration, a ritual that nobody wrote down and nobody needs to explain because everyone present already understands what it means. Those 2 people are now a pair, recognized, formalized, as official as anything gets in a world without paperwork. Nobody taught them to do this. There was no priest, no state, no legal contract, no venue deposit they were definitely going to lose. There was just a group of humans who had somehow, across hundreds of thousands of years of living together, arrived at the same arrangement, independently, on every continent, in every culture, in every era of recorded history.
Every human society that has ever been studied practices some form of marriage. Not the same form. The rules differ wildly. Who you're allowed to marry, how many, whether you choose or your family does, what happens if it ends. All of that varies enormously. But the underlying structure, 2 or more people publicly committing to each other in a way the group recognizes, is universal in a way that almost nothing else is. Marriage doesn't appear to be a cultural invention that spread from one place. It appears to be something humans keep arriving at on their own, which means the question is not where it came from. The question is why it keeps happening at all. Because marriage is not obvious, it is not easy, and it solves problems that most people have never actually identified as problems. This is the story of what those problems were, and it starts long before anyone had a word for any of it.
Before you can understand why marriage exists, you need to understand a specific problem that human reproduction created, a problem that no other primate had to solve in quite the same way. Human infants are, by any biological standard, absurdly helpless. A baby giraffe stands up and walks within hours of birth. A foal is running within a day. A human infant cannot hold its own head up for months, cannot walk for a year, cannot survive independently for somewhere between 8 and 12 years, depending on how forgiving the environment is. This is not an accident. The human brain grows so dramatically after birth, more than tripling in size in the first year alone, that it cannot be fully developed inside the womb without making delivery physiologically impossible. So humans are born early by mammalian standards and spend an enormous proportion of childhood in a state of near total dependence.
What this means for a foraging group on the African savanna is that a woman with a young child cannot simultaneously gather food at the rate she needs to, carry the child, protect the child, and keep everyone fed. The math simply does not work. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living analog to how our ancestors lived for most of human history, consistently show that a mother with children under the age of 4 cannot gather enough calories on her own to sustain herself and her offspring. She needs provisioning from someone else, reliably, consistently, not occasionally, not when it's convenient, but as a continuous, committed arrangement. This is the problem, and here is what makes it unusual. Most primates don't have it to nearly this degree. Chimp infants are dependent for far shorter periods. Chimp females can provision themselves adequately while raising offspring. They mate opportunistically. They move on. The social architecture does not require anything else.
Human children changed the calculation entirely. A human male who helped provision a specific female's children was directly increasing the survival odds of offspring who were, in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, probably his. A male who did not help was gambling that those children would survive anyway, which in the environment our ancestors lived in was a genuinely bad bet. The investment had real returns. This is not a romantic story. This is a resource problem with a reproductive solution. But it is where the architecture of pair bonding begins, not with love, not with ritual, not with any concept of commitment, but with a very cold calculation about who was going to feed the children when the children could not feed themselves. Here is the part that most explanations of marriage skip entirely. Pair bonding between 2 individuals does not automatically explain marriage. Lots of species pair bond without anything resembling a public ceremony. Gibbons are monogamous, beavers are monogamous, albatrosses form pair bonds that last decades. None of them hold a ceremony, none of them require witnesses. The bond is just a fact between the 2 animals involved, and the rest of the world has no opinion about it either way.
What made human pair bonding different, what turned a private arrangement between two people into a social institution, was the problem of competing males. In a group of humans living in close proximity, a paired male who leaves to hunt is leaving his partner accessible to every other male in the group. Without some kind of group recognition that this pair is an established unit, the incentive for other males to challenge that arrangement is significant. The provisioning deal breaks down. The male stops investing. The children lose their provision source. The whole arrangement collapses. Anthropologist Bernard Chapais, who has spent decades studying the evolution of kinship and marriage, argues that public pair bonding, the declaration in front of the group, is essentially a coordination mechanism. When the group witnesses and recognizes a pair, it creates a shared understanding that lowers the frequency of male-male conflict over mates. The recognition says, this is settled. Everyone has a position. The fighting that would otherwise happen continuously does not happen because the status of the pair is already socially established.
This is also why marriage almost universally involves the extended family, not just the two people involved. The family recognition matters because it extends the coalition. Her family knows about the arrangement, his family knows. Both families now have a stake in the arrangement holding. They become enforcers of a deal they were part of making, which is enormously more stable than a deal that only two people know about and only two people are motivated to maintain. What looks from the outside like a celebration is actually the activation of a social enforcement mechanism. Every witness is becoming, in a small way, a guarantor of the arrangement. The feast is not just a party, it is a memory installation. Everyone who is there now has a stake in the fact of the union and will remember it and will care whether it holds. Marriage is not just two people deciding something together. It is two people making the group decide something with them. That distinction is the entire point, and it is why the ceremony exists at all.
Once you understand that marriage functions as a social contract with group enforcement, something else becomes apparent. It is also the most powerful alliance-building tool that human societies have ever developed. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist whose work on kinship remains foundational to the field, made the argument that marriage, at its structural core, is not primarily about the two people involved. It is about the relationship between the two families. The individuals are almost incidental. What matters is that two previously separate kinship groups have now created a bond between them that is biological, ongoing, and socially recognized. Their children are kin to both sides. The grandparents have a shared interest. The cousins are connected. A network of mutual obligation now exists that did not exist before, and that network is maintained and reinforced every time that marriage produces children, and extended every time those children have children of their own. In a world without contracts, without courts, without any state apparatus to enforce agreements, this is extraordinarily valuable. How do you stop a neighboring group from attacking yours? You make their children your grandchildren. How do you ensure access to resources controlled by a group across the river? You make someone from that group the parent of your grandchildren. Marriage converts strangers into relatives, and relatives, across most of human history, have been the only people you could reliably count on in a crisis. This is why marriage rules are so elaborate in almost every human society ever studied. The rules about who you can marry, who you cannot marry, who you are obligated to marry, these are not arbitrary taboos. They are kinship engineering. They are deliberate attempts to build alliance networks that are maximally useful for the group's survival. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies have found that marriage patterns across generations can be traced as explicit political strategies. Families using marriage to extend reach, settle disputes, forge coalitions, and repair relationships that conflict has damaged. The prohibition on marrying close relatives, which appears in some form in virtually every human society, is partly explained by genetics. But it was observed and enforced thousands of years before anyone knew what genetics was. The practical reason is alliance. If you marry someone you are already related to, you create no new connections. You just reinforce existing ones. The incest taboo, from a purely strategic standpoint, is a rule that forces groups outward, that compels the creation of new bonds rather than the recycling of old ones. Marriage, in this frame, is not a personal institution. It is a foreign policy tool. And for most of human history, it was the only one available. For most of human history, the idea that you would marry someone because you were in love with them would have been considered, at best, a nice coincidence. At worst, it would have been viewed as a dangerously unreliable basis for an arrangement with serious economic and political consequences. The marriage for love idea, the notion that the purpose of marriage is romantic fulfillment between two individuals who chose each other freely, is, by the standards of human history, extremely new. Historian Stephanie Kunst, who has traced the history of marriage across cultures and centuries, dates the mainstream adoption of romantic love as the primary basis for marriage to somewhere around the late 18th and early 19th century in Western Europe and North America. Before that, across the vast majority of cultures and time periods, marriage was arranged by families, negotiated by kin groups, and justified primarily in terms of economic stability, political alliance, and social obligation. The feelings of the people getting married were, at best, a secondary consideration.
What changed? Several things, arriving in roughly the same historical window. Industrialization meant that people could earn their own income independent of family land or family business, which meant the economic argument for letting your family choose your spouse weakened substantially. Geographic mobility meant you might not marry someone your family even knew. Rising literacy and the spread of romantic novels, and this sounds trivial, but the research suggests it genuinely wasn't, created a cultural expectation that romantic passion was not just a pleasant bonus, but an actual prerequisite. The shift happened remarkably fast by historical standards. Within a few generations, in cultures where arranged marriage had been standard practice for thousands of years, the idea of marrying someone your family had selected for economic or political reasons went from normal to vaguely unsettling to, in many places, actively illegal. The emotional purpose of marriage was reassigned. It was no longer primarily about alliance or resource management. It was now about companionship, mutual fulfillment, and the sustained presence of the person you loved most in the world.
This is a genuinely radical transformation. The same institution, two people publicly committing to each other in a group-recognized arrangement, now carried completely different freight. The structure was almost identical. The function had been almost entirely replaced. And that created a problem that marriage for alliance never had to deal with. Alliances don't need to make you happy. They just need to hold. But marriage for love needs to deliver something that is, by its nature, difficult to sustain indefinitely. And when it doesn't, the entire justification for the arrangement collapses in a way that it simply didn't when the arrangement was primarily about land and grandchildren.
Here is the distinction that almost never gets made when people argue about marriage, and it matters enormously. Marriage as a biological tendency and marriage as a legal institution are not the same thing, and they have never been the same thing. The biological tendency, pair bonding, preferring a consistent partner, investing in shared offspring, appears to be genuinely ancient. The neurochemistry supports it. Oxytocin and vasopressin, the hormones most associated with pair bonding in mammals, operate in humans in ways that are structurally similar to how they operate in prairie voles, one of the few rodent species that is genuinely monogamous. The attachment system that keeps you thinking about a specific person, that makes separation from them feel like an actual physical discomfort, is not a cultural invention. It is wired in, running below awareness, and it was probably operating in recognizable form long before anyone built a ceremony around it. The legal institution, property rights, inheritance, custody, the formal recognition of family membership arrived much later and solved completely different problems. Once humans started accumulating heritable wealth, the question of who got it became urgent in a way it simply was not when everyone was carrying everything they owned on their back. Marriage as a legal structure is fundamentally a property management system. Remove the property question from human society, and a significant portion of what marriage law actually does disappears with it. What this means is that modern debates about marriage are almost always conducted as if marriage were a single thing with a single origin and a single purpose. It is not. It is at least three things layered on top of each other: a biological tendency toward pair bonding, a social mechanism for group coordination and alliance, and a legal apparatus for property and inheritance. These three things emerged at different times for different reasons, in response to different pressures. They have always coexisted uneasily.
The cultures that emphasize marriage as an economic alliance and the cultures that emphasize it as romantic fulfillment are not practicing different versions of the same thing. They are prioritizing different layers of an institution that was never unified to begin with. When people say marriage is in crisis, they are usually pointing at the romantic layer, the expectation that a single relationship should deliver lifelong companionship, economic partnership, physical intimacy, social identity, and emotional support simultaneously. That is an extraordinary amount of weight to put on any arrangement. For most of human history, those functions were distributed across families, communities, and social structures that no longer exist in quite the same form. Marriage has been doing multiple jobs at once for a very long time. The question of whether it is still doing them well is a different question from the one people usually ask.
We talk about marriage as if it's a thing people invented for emotional reasons and then kept for sentimental ones. The reality is considerably stranger and more interesting than that. It begins with a biological fact about human infants and the caloric math of keeping them alive. It develops into a coordination mechanism for reducing male competition in groups that were too small to absorb continuous conflict. It becomes an alliance technology that shaped the political geography of entire continents over thousands of years. It gets transformed in the space of a few centuries from a fundamentally economic and political arrangement into a fundamentally emotional one. And it is now being asked to do for two people in a largely atomized social world, work that was previously distributed across extended families, kinship networks, and community structures that most people no longer have access to.
The research on what makes long-term relationships stable is solid. Shared goals, consistent small acts of investment, the ability to repair conflict rather than avoid it, genuine interest in the other person's inner life. What the research does not support is the idea that the right initial feeling guarantees a sustainable long-term outcome. The feeling is the beginning. What comes after the feeling is an entirely different set of skills, and those skills are not installed automatically by falling in love. There is also still something genuinely unresolved in this picture. Across every culture, humans form pair bonds, but across those same cultures, a significant proportion of those bonds break down. The pair bonding tendency is real, so is the tendency for it to erode. Both appear to be part of the same evolved package, which suggests that what we think of as the problem, the difficulty of sustaining long-term commitment, is not a failure of the system. It may simply be what the system actually looks like from the inside. Two people stood in front of their group. Something was exchanged. Something was recognized. The group was now a guarantor of an arrangement between two people, who were probably not thinking about property law or kinship algebra or the neurochemistry of pair bonding. They were just two people who had decided to face whatever was coming together. We still don't fully understand why that works. We just know it keeps happening.